The morning Claudia Reyes almost died started like every other morning that August, with the smell of industrial cleaner and the particular ache that comes from sleeping on a pull-out couch in your aunt's living room for 6 months straight. She was 28, which felt both too young and too old for the situation she was in. Too young to have already buried a marriage, too old to be starting over with everything she owned packed into 2 suitcases pushed against someone else's wall. Her daughter, Sophie, was 4 and still small enough to share the pullout with her, which was the only mercy in any of it. Claudia had taken the overnight shift at the Grand Meridian because the day shift paid less and she needed every dollar she could pull together before Sophie started pre-K in September. The hotel sat in the middle of downtown Chicago, 43 floors of marble and glass, catering to people whose casual dinners cost more than Claudia's rent had back when she still had rent. She'd been working the front desk for 11 months, long enough to know which guests preferred to be greeted by name, which ones wanted no conversation at all, and which ones were quietly, carefully watching the exits. That, last learned to spot-sat, that until the night of August 14th. The lobby of the Grand Meridian went quiet around 2 in the morning, in the particular way that expensive places did. Not empty, just hushed, a businessman nursing a whiskey in the far lounge, a couple by the elevator who looked like they were either falling in love or ending something. The night porter, Gary, doing a slow circuit of the marble floor with his cloth, moving like a man who'd made peace with the hours a long time ago. Claudia was running end-of-day checkout reports when the man in the grey suit came down from the elevators. She noticed him because he wasn't right. Not wrong in any way she could name immediately. His suit was expensive, his shoes polished, his posture controlled. But something about the angle of his approach to the lobby, the way his eyes moved in small, deliberate sweeps before his feet followed. It was the walk of someone who was counting exits before he took another step. She'd seen that walk twice in her life. Once from a man her uncle was afraid of. Once from a detective who came to tell her family something had happened. She went back to her reports. The man settled in the lobby, seating near the fountain, facing the main entrance. Not the bar, not the lounge. Just sitting, with one hand resting on the arm of the chair in a way that looked casual and wasn't. 10 minutes later, the second set of elevator doors opened. Adrian Caruso came down alone, which Claudia later learned was unusual. He was in his mid-40s, tall in the way that fills a doorframe without trying, dark hair going silver at the sides, and wearing a charcoal suit that sat on his shoulders like it had been born there. She'd checked him in 2 days ago. Suite 3802, reserved under the name of a real estate holding company, paid in advance. He'd tipped her nothing and thanked her with a nod that somehow felt more sincere than most people's full smiles. She'd thought at the time, this man is used to rooms closing around him. Now she watched him cross the lobby toward the concierge desk, his path taking him past the fountain, past the man in the grey suit who had not moved in 10 minutes. The man in the grey suit shifted, just his right shoulder, just slightly. The kind of micro-movement that Claudia wouldn't have caught if she hadn't been watching, if she hadn't been still half-focused on the wrongness of him since he came down. His hand moved from the armrest toward the inside of his jacket. It was the stillness after the movement that made her understand. His hand stopped, positioned, waiting. Adrian Caruso was 6 feet away from him and closing. Claudia didn't think. That was the thing she'd try to explain later and fail every time. Her body made the decision before her brain had filed the paperwork. She was around the front desk in 4 steps, covering the distance between them in a straight line, and she stepped directly into Adrian Caruso's path, with her arm going out, catching his chest, pushing him sideways behind the marble pillar at the edge of the fountain. She heard the sound, a flat, hard crack that bounced off the marble floor and the 40-foot ceiling simultaneously, so that for half a second she couldn't tell where it had come from. The lobby detonated into chaos. The couple by the elevator dropped. Gary hit the floor. The businessman knocked over his drink and didn't notice. Someone was screaming from the lounge. Claudia had her back against the pillar, and Adrian Caruso was pressed beside her, breathing, and she felt something burn along her left forearm and thought distantly, "That's warm." Then 2 men who had not been visible 30 seconds ago materialized from somewhere near the hotel entrance, and the man in the grey suit went down hard onto the marble with his hands wrenched behind him, and it was over. Or it was over in that particular way where the sound stops but the ringing doesn't. "Are you injured?" The voice beside her was controlled in a way that took effort. She could hear the effort. Claudia looked at her arm. There was a tear in the sleeve of her uniform blazer. Below it, a line of red. "I think the marble got me," she said, and she heard her own voice come out steady and was distantly surprised by that. Adrian Caruso looked at her arm, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't read. That wasn't the marble. The next 40 minutes happened in a blur of uniforms. Police, paramedics, hotel management. Her general manager, Ronald Park, arrived looking like a man who'd been yanked out of sleep and hadn't fully arrived in the situation yet. 2 plainclothes detectives took her to a side office and asked her to walk them through it twice. A paramedic wrapped her forearm with practiced efficiency and told her the bullet had grazed the outside of her arm, that she was lucky, that she'd need a few stitches and should come in for proper treatment. She kept thinking about Sophie, not in a panicked way, more in the way that your mind retreats to the most important thing when everything else becomes too large to hold. Sophie was at Aunt Renata's, asleep, small and safe, and entirely unaware that her mother was sitting in the Grand Meridian's employee lounge with a bandaged arm, giving a statement to a detective who kept asking if she'd known the man in the grey suit. She hadn't. She'd told them that 4 times. Detective Andrea Walsh, 40s, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the energy of someone who preferred questions to answers, closed her notepad near the end of the interview. "Mrs. Reyes, do you know who Adrian Caruso is?" Claudia had suspected this was coming since the moment she'd heard the name said aloud by the first officer on scene, said in that specific careful tone people use when a name carries weight. "He's a guest at this hotel," Claudia said. Detective Walsh looked at her steadily. "Adrian Caruso has substantial business interests in construction, logistics, and commercial real estate throughout the Midwest. He's also a person of considerable interest to several federal investigations, none of which have produced charges." She let that sit a moment. "The man who tried to harm him tonight has ties to an organization that has been in conflict with Mr. Caruso's interests for some time. This was planned, targeted, and you are now, whether you intended it or not, a complication in that plan." Claudia absorbed this the way you absorb a doctor telling you something you'd been half expecting, but hoping wouldn't be true. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying the people who arranged tonight don't respond well to disruption. You disrupted something they invested significantly in." Walsh set a card on the table. "Mr. Caruso has already contacted his team about your situation. He's also arranged to cover all of your medical expenses. I want you to know that you didn't have to do what you did tonight. Most people wouldn't have." "I know," Claudia said quietly. She took the card. The hospital was 20 minutes away and smelled the same as every hospital she'd ever been in. Antiseptic and recycled air, and the specific silence of a building where serious things happen quietly. A doctor with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, cleaned and stitched the wound, gave her antibiotics and a prescription for pain, and told her to keep it dry for 5 days and come back if she saw any sign of infection. She was sitting in the discharge waiting area, still in her torn uniform, when Adrian Caruso walked in. He'd changed. Dark slacks, a black coat that looked like it cost what Claudia made in a month. His hair was damp at the edges, his expression contained in the practiced way of a man who had long ago learned that composure was a resource you had to conserve. "Mrs. Reyes." He stopped a careful distance away. "I wanted to come personally. You didn't have to." "No," he said it simply, without arguing the point. "How's the arm?" 7 stitches. I'll live." Something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. "You saved my life tonight. I'm aware that's not a small thing. I'm not sure I was thinking about it in those terms at the time." "No," he said again. That's what made it real. He sat down across from her, which surprised her. She'd expected him to stay standing. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that weren't just tiredness, and the very slight tension in his jaw that suggested the controlled composure was working harder than it looked. "The detective spoke with you." "She did. Then you have some understanding of the situation you've walked into." Claudia folded her hands in her lap. Adrian looked at her steadily. "The man who came after me tonight works for a family that has been trying to eliminate my influence in this city for 3 years. Tonight was their most serious attempt. You stopped it, which means they now have a problem. Not just a failed plan, but a witness, an obstacle, someone who matters in this story when they'd prefer their story had no interruptions." He paused. "These people are patient, and they have long memories, so what does that mean for me? It means I'd like to offer you protection while my people work to resolve the situation. You would need to relocate temporarily. There is a property outside the city. Secure, private, staffed." He met her eyes. "I understand this is an enormous ask from a stranger. I also understand that the alternative is leaving you exposed in a situation you were pulled into entirely by your own courage." Claudia thought about her aunt's living room. Sophie's backpack hanging on the door handle, purple with a small elephant on the front. The pull-out couch that creaked when Sophie turned over in the night. "I have a daughter," she said. Adrian didn't react with surprise, which meant someone had already told him. "She would come with you. Your family's safety is part of this." She looked at him for a long moment. "I need to think." Of course. He handed her a card, the same heavy stock as the detective's but starker. Just a name and a number. This is Thomas, my head of security. Call him when you've decided, whatever time it is. He stood to leave, then paused. Mrs. Reyes, that sound you heard. The movement you recognized before he drew. Not everyone would have caught that. Not everyone would have acted on it. He looked at her with an expression that felt, strangely, like respect. Trust your instincts. They're worth something. Then he was gone, and Claudia sat alone in the discharge waiting room and stared at the card until a nurse came to tell her the car arranged under Caruso's account was waiting outside. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the pullout beside Sophie, listening to her daughter breathe, running the conversation with Detective Walsh through her mind on a loop. Long memories, planned and targeted, a complication in their plan. By 4 a.m, she had made her decision. She called Thomas at 4:15. He answered on the second ring, which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of operation she was dealing with. Mrs. Reyes, he said, I'll be there at 7. Thomas Breck was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her mind of someone like the men who'd appeared from nowhere in the lobby, silent, angular, contained. Thomas was instead a heavy-set man in his early 60s with a grey beard and the careful eyes of someone who had been doing a difficult job for a long time and had made his peace with most of it. He arrived in a black SUV with 2 other people, moved through Aunt Renata's apartment with quiet efficiency, and spoke to Renata with a directness and courtesy that made her aunt, who trusted no one, a quality Claudia had always respected. Nod and say, okay, go. The drive north took an hour. The city dissolved into suburbs into rural stretches, and eventually into a private road that wound through mature trees and opened onto a property that stopped Claudia's breath. It wasn't a mansion in the way movies meant. It was something more understated than that. A large house built in the style of an old Illinois estate, brick and dark wood, surrounded by grounds that had been tended for decades. In the morning light, it looked like something from a different era, solid and permanent in a way that Claudia's life had never quite been. Sophie pressed her face against the car window. Is this a hotel? No, baby. It's where we're going to stay, for a little while. Does it have a yard? It has a big yard. Okay, Sophie said, satisfied in the way only 4-year-olds could be, and went back to her picture book. Adrian Caruso was waiting at the entrance. He crouched down when he saw Sophie, an unguarded, instinctive movement, and said, Hi, I'm Adrian. I hear you like elephants. Sophie looked at him with the specific appraising seriousness of small children. How do you know that? He stood. Welcome, both of you. He'd arranged a suite for them in the house's east wing. 3 rooms, a bedroom for Claudia, a smaller adjacent room that someone had already stocked with a toddler bed, a white noise machine, and a basket of children's books, and a sitting room between them. Claudia stood in the doorway of Sophie's room and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known she was holding tight. The first week was surreal. The property had staff who moved with careful efficiency, a housekeeper named Ruth who brought breakfast trays without being asked, and somehow always knew when Claudia wanted to be alone and when she didn't. Thomas did a briefing with her on day 2, access points, security protocols, check-in procedures, that made the danger feel abstract and real at the same time. Sophie explored the yard with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of new places, and Claudia worked on her online real estate licensing course at a desk in the sitting room, which was the practical thing she'd been working toward for 8 months, and saw no reason to stop. She and Adrian passed each other in the house. Hallways, shared meals when their schedules landed at the same time. A brief exchange in the library one afternoon when she needed the Wi-Fi password and found him there with a glass of water and a stack of contract documents. He was in the house more than she'd expected. She'd assumed he would be in the city, running whatever it was he ran. But Thomas told her at some point that Adrian had deliberately reduced his schedule to maintain his own security. He was running something. She could see it in the phone calls that happened in his study with the door closed, in the tightening around his eyes at certain hours of the day, in the way Thomas's expression changed when certain names came up in conversation. On the 9th day, Claudia knocked on his study door. He opened it looking like a man who'd been awake since before she had, which was before 5. Can I ask you something? He stepped back to let her in. The study was the most personal room she'd seen in the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, not of books, but of architectural scale models, miniature buildings rendered in white cardboard and balsa wood with the precision of someone who had taken the work seriously. She stopped. You built these? When I was 22. Before. He moved to the window, hands in his pockets. I studied urban planning at Illinois, was going to work for a firm in the city. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood the shape of what came after. Before. the word that changed everything. What happened, my father? He said it the way people say weather, a fact rather than a complaint. He died when I was 23. There were things that needed to be handled, and I was the only one who could handle them. You make decisions in moments like that and you tell yourself they're temporary, and then 15 years go by. Claudia looked at a model of what she recognized as Chicago's old Main post office, rendered with extraordinary detail. Do you regret it? He was quiet for a moment. I regret that I didn't get to find out who I would have been doing that work. He looked at her. You were going to ask me something. I was. She turned from the models. The people who planned what happened at the hotel. What's actually happening with them? Because Thomas gives me security updates and not much else, and I'm not someone who does well with not knowing. Adrian studied her. Then he moved to a chair across from the desk and sat, which she'd learned was his signal that a conversation was going to be real. The family that arranged the attempt is called the Brannigan Organization, he said. They've been operating in this city for 40 years, and they're facing pressure from younger groups, from federal scrutiny, from a lot of directions at once. Coming after me was a power move, a way to demonstrate that they could still do the things they've always done, that their reach was intact. He paused. My people are in negotiation with certain intermediaries. There's a path where this ends without further conflict. The Brannigan family, if they're rational, will recognize that they want out of the kind of business that brings federal heat, and that I'm in a position to help them do that. And if they're not rational, then we have a longer problem. Claudia sat on the opposite chair. Thomas said you've been having these conversations for 2 weeks, yes, and in those conversations, does anyone mention me? His jaw tightened slightly. You are a complication they would prefer to resolve. My position is that any resolution that includes harm to you is not a resolution I'll accept. That's a parameter they understand. She held his gaze. So I'm leverage. You're under my protection, he said quietly. That's not leverage. That's obligation. There's a difference, and I'd like you to understand that I see the difference. For a moment, the room was very still. Outside, she could hear faint sounds of Sophie in the yard with Ruth, some game involving a great deal of running. Those models, Claudia said finally. The buildings you designed, did you ever go back to any of them? Adrian blinked, pulled from whatever he'd been bracing for. No, why not? Because the version of me who designed them doesn't exist anymore. That's not true, she said carefully. The version of you who designed them is the version who let David Chen. Sorry, is the version who makes choices in a certain direction instead of an easier one. I see it. It's the same things. He looked at her for a long moment. You're perceptive. I work a front desk. You spend a lot of time watching people when you work a front desk. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. What did you see when I came through that lobby the first time? 2 days before, someone who was used to rooms closing around him, she said. Someone who was tired of it. This time it was a smile, brief and real. That's accurate. The knock on the door came at a dead run. Thomas opened it without waiting, which told her everything before he'd said a word. We have a problem. His eyes moved to Claudia with an apology in them. They know she's here. We had an information breach. Someone in our network was feeding them location data. We identified it an hour ago, but the damage is done. They have the address. Adrian was on his feet before Thomas finished. When? We don't know their timeline, but we have to assume it's short. We're implementing the lockdown now. Thomas looked at Claudia directly. Mrs. Reyes, we need to move you and your daughter to the secure room. Claudia was already standing. Ruth has her. She's already on her way inside. Claudia moved. She found Sophie in the hallway between the kitchen and the main corridor, in Ruth's arms, clutching a stuffed animal, and looking at the sudden bustle of activity with wide eyes. Claudia took her daughter and held her close and felt Sophie's arms go tight around her neck without questions, because Sophie had been through enough upheaval to know that when her mother said, "Hold on," you held on. We're going to play a quiet game, Claudia said against Sophie's hair, in a special room. Remember the game where we're very still and very quiet and see how long we can last? I always beat you, Sophie said. You always beat me, Claudia agreed. Come on. The secure room was a reinforced space below the main floor, the kind of room that said someone had planned for exactly this scenario, which was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Thomas left them with a two-way radio, a cot and a children's mat with a blanket, and instructions that were simple. Stay. Wait. Don't come out until he came for them personally. Sophie fell asleep within 20 minutes, curled on the mat with her stuffed animal tucked under her arm. She was 4. She didn't know what the sounds above them meant when they started. Engines, raised voices, the distant concussion of something that rattled the light fixture. Claudia sat on the cot in the reinforced room and thought about decisions. About a 4-step run across a marble lobby, about a sound she'd recognized without being able to explain how, about a man who'd built small, perfect buildings and been pulled away from that life by obligation, and had spent 15 years becoming something he'd never chosen, and who still, even now, made certain choices in a certain direction. She thought about what Detective Walsh had told her. Most people wouldn't have. She'd acted without thought, but she was thinking now, in the quiet of a room that had been built for exactly this kind of thinking, and what she thought was, she didn't regret it. The radio crackled. Adrian's voice came through with a clarity that meant he was calm, which was the most useful thing he could have communicated. All teams, hold positions. No engagement unless directly threatened. We are moving to the resolution phase. The sounds above her continued for another hour. Claudia didn't know what resolution phase meant exactly in operational terms. She held Sophie's hand and listened and was still. When Thomas came to get them, his expression told her it was over before he said a word. They came with 4 people. We contained the situation without injury on our side. He looked at her steadily. Adrian wants to see you. She found him in the main hall, still in the same clothes, on the phone. He ended the call when he saw her and came across the room with a directness that felt different from all their previous conversations, less managed. Sophie, was the first thing he said. Asleep. She thinks we played a quiet game. He exhaled. The Brannigan representatives have agreed to a meeting tomorrow. Tonight's failure, and the fact that it became a failure in front of witnesses they'd prefer not to antagonize, has pushed them toward the table. Thomas thinks they'll accept the framework. He paused. I think so too. What does that mean for me? It means in the next few days, you and Sophie could go home. He said it evenly, but something in his face wasn't quite even. If that's what you want. It was 2 a.m. The house was lit and there was still personnel moving through it, but the quality of the movement had changed, purposeful rather than urgent. Somewhere down the hall she could hear Ruth making tea. Claudia thought about her aunt's living room. The pull-out couch, the 2 suitcases. I have an exam next week, she said. For my real estate license. I know, a beat. Thomas mentioned it. Thomas mentions a lot of things to you, he does. Adrian's mouth curved. He also mentioned that you'd been studying for 6 months, and that the exam is something you've been working towards seriously. Can you take an exam from a secure property? The testing can be arranged remotely. I should have offered that sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Claudia looked at him, this man who had buildings in miniature on his shelves and weight in his eyes, and who had come to a hospital at 11 at night because he'd believed it mattered to come in person. Adrian. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and she watched him register it. Before all of this is settled, before I know what going home looks like, I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer. The choices you've been making. David, she caught herself. The people you've been dealing with this week, the way this situation ends, are you choosing the kind of ending that you can look at afterward? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, thinking through an honest answer. I'm trying to, he said finally. I'm trying to build something that holds, instead of just winning. Those aren't always the same. He met her eyes. You asked me once if I regret who I became. I think the answer is that I'm still deciding who that is, which is either optimistic or delusional, depending on how you look at it. Optimistic, Claudia said. Definitely optimistic. He looked at her with an expression that had nothing careful in it. Go get some sleep, Ms. Reyes, Claudia, she said. I think we're past Ms. Reyes. Go get some sleep, Claudia. She did, and the next 2 days moved differently. Lighter, somehow even through the formal negotiations that Thomas briefed her on in summaries, the agreements being reached in rooms she wasn't part of, the calls that came and went from Adrian's study until finally, on a Thursday afternoon, Thomas came to her sitting room door and said, It's done. The Brannigan organization had accepted the framework, transition out of their previous operations, over time, in exchange for certain assurances and the kind of peace that came from everyone recognizing the cost of the alternative. No guarantee of anything, Tom said carefully, but a settlement. A real one. You're safe, he said. Both of you. Claudia sat with that for a moment. Sophie was on the floor behind her, arranging a set of wooden blocks into what she'd been calling a city for the last hour, talking quietly to herself about who lived in which building. She'd found the blocks in a cabinet in the sitting room. Later, Claudia would learn that Adrian had asked Ruth to find them. She took her real estate exam 5 days later, remotely from the sitting room desk, while Sophie napped. She passed with a score that made her laugh out loud alone in the room. She told Adrian that evening. They'd developed a habit by then of crossing paths in the kitchen in the late afternoon, neither of them quite acknowledging that the crossings weren't accidental. He looked genuinely pleased. What did you score? She told him. That's not luck, he said. That's 6 months of work. 8, actually. I started before all of this, 8. He looked at her with something in his expression that she'd been getting better at reading. What happens now? I go home, she said. I find a job in real estate. I get Sophie into pre-K. I figure out an apartment, she paused. The ordinary things, yes. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to stay in contact if you're open to that. Not in a... He stopped, which was the most uncertain she'd ever seen him. I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking if I can call you sometimes. Claudia looked at him. You could, she said carefully, or you could come to Sophie's birthday in October. She's going to be 5 and she's already mentioned you twice this week without being prompted. Something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded. She has? She asked Ruth if the man with the buildings would be there. Apparently she found the study. Claudia let that land. She wants to know about the buildings. Adrian's throat moved. I'd like that okay, Claudia said. Then it's a plan. She left the property on a Saturday morning, Thomas driving them back into the city, Sophie with her face against the window, and a new picture book in her lap that had appeared on her bed the night before. Thick board pages, a story about a girl who becomes an architect. There was no name written in it. There didn't need to be. The city came back gradually, the same way it always did. First the skyline, then the density, then the particular smell and sound of Chicago getting on with itself, regardless of what had happened to anyone. Inside it. Her aunt's building appeared around a corner, familiar and a little worn, and Claudia thought, I have things to do. She thought Sophie starts school in 4 weeks. She thought, I passed my exam. She thought about a man who had crouched down in a doorway to ask a 4-year-old about her backpack, who had buildings on his shelves that he built when he still thought he was going to build real ones, who had chosen harder every time he could have chosen easier. Some things, she had learned, you didn't plan. You showed up at work on an ordinary night, and you heard a sound and you moved, and everything that came after was simply what you made of the fact that you were still there to make something of it. She had her daughter. She had her license. She had her name in her own mouth, and her feet on familiar ground and an October birthday to plan. That was enough to start with. And starting, she'd found, was usually the hardest part.